Hey Ben, how you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
How are things out there today?
Things are good out in Iowa. How are things in Connecticut?
Well, they're just wonderful. So this is very exciting, Ben, to have you on today, and I'm super excited about what you're presenting. I was there when you received the award at UConn. I was fortunate enough to be there for that ceremony for the undergraduate philosophy award. I think what was that for the highest GPA in the philosophy
Hmm.
department at UConn?
Yep, for my class. Yeah.
That's pretty outstanding. So congratulations to that
Thank you.
for that. And yeah, I'm happy to talk to you about this. I am very involved in artificial intelligence now from the technology standpoint. But from our standpoint on the tech side, we don't really think a lot about philosophy and some of your background. So this is sort of a blending of philosophy and technology coming together. And I know that you and I have had a similar conversation with this AI chatbot called Hey Pi, created by Mustafa Suleiman, one of the original founders of DeepMind. And we've chatted with it since it came out. You talked to it a lot about philosophy and consciousness, and I talked to it a lot about how to have a great mentorship program. And so you put together some really cool thoughts through your conversations, and this is your opportunity to share to everybody out there. And I appreciate you for doing this. So thank you very
Mhm.
much. I'm going to kick it over to you now. Okay.
Consciousness and computation, a dialogue with Hey Pi. So today we're going to be talking about consciousness, AI. Ultimately, can AI become conscious? And what do we mean by that? So a little bit about my background to start off. I have bachelor's degrees in cognitive science and philosophy from the University of Connecticut. I also got a minor in neuroscience, so a lot focused on the mind. And I'm currently earning a master's degree in consciousness and human potential from Maharishi International University, which is where I am right now. And this diagram here is the different areas of cognitive science because it's interdisciplinary. They come together to study the mind. So, our outline for today, we're going to look at what is consciousness, what is computation, different philosophical theories of consciousness, and then can AI become conscious? And what exactly do we mean by conscious AI? And then we go into a dialogue with a chatbot, how I got it to reveal that it's probably not conscious. Then we'll go into the future of the science of consciousness and how humans and AI can work together in solving the mystery of explaining consciousness. So, what do we mean by consciousness? This is a philosopher's favorite phrase to use. What do we mean? So, we're simply talking about awareness, the capacity to be aware of our existence. In philosophy of mind, this is known as subjective experience or sentience. The more technical words, qualia or phenomenality. But these all are referring to the same thing. Qualia is picking out the qualitative aspects of experience: redness, sweetness, warmth, pleasure, pain. There's something it's like to experience that, to see red, to taste sweetness. So ultimately, consciousness is something it's like to be a being or to have an experience. And it's important to note here that cognition is not the same thing as consciousness. Cognition refers to thinking, reasoning, inferences, whereas consciousness is just the raw experience. For all we know, a worm could have consciousness. That doesn't mean it has much complex cognition. So it's important to distinguish between the two. So the hard problem of consciousness. This is one of the biggest unsolved problems in philosophy right now. It's a real hot topic. And it refers to the explanatory gap between physical processes that we can describe with physics and phenomenal consciousness, the subjective experience that we were talking about. It's the question, why should any physical processes have subjective experiences associated with them? For example, neurons firing and the actual experience of red, as you can see in the diagram here. The actual experience would be the phenomenal consciousness. So why should one be associated with the other? How do physical processes give rise to, or why are they identical to conscious experiences? So right now, what neuroscience is doing is specifying the neural correlates of consciousness. Someone will report seeing red, and then they'll do brain imaging and say, oh, well, this part of the brain is active, these circuits are active, and those are correlated with the reported experience of red. Yes, Greg.
So we have questions coming in from around the world, and one of them is, are we close to solving this problem of consciousness? Where are we with this right now?
Are we close to solving it? Well, in my opinion, it's already solved. But in terms of consensus, we are not close to a consensus among philosophers or scientists. There are many different competing theories, which we'll get into in a minute. But basically, there is no accepted solution to this problem within philosophy right now. But there are many theories which claim to have solved it or dissolved the problem, which we'll get into in a few slides. But excellent question.
Thanks. I'll pass that on.
Alrighty, what do we mean by computation? This is something that's not really looked at in depth by even computer scientists and computer programmers. They know how to do it, but what is it exactly that's going on in computation? Well, what it is transformations of symbols by an algorithm. For example, a calculator. Symbols are input, those symbols are transformed, and symbols are output. It's a purely mechanical process. And then we interpret those symbols to have meaning. So the calculator doesn't understand what the symbols are. It's just doing algorithmic transformations. And we see the symbols, we interpret it into meaning. So that's the important thing to notice, that symbols are representations. They need to be interpreted to have meaning. They don't have meaning by themselves. And an algorithm is a formally defined step-by-step procedure for transforming these inputs into outputs. So in a nutshell, that's what computation is. So connectionism. This is an increasingly popular form of computation for AI, the simulated neural networks that were inspired by the brain. So this is different than classical computation, but it's not incompatible. Whereas in classical computation, you have this language of thought made of discrete mental symbols. These symbols are processed by information processing unit. But here the symbols are represented by the connection strengths between different nodes of the network. And in the human brain, these connection strengths are realized by the weights of connections between neurons. And so these different weighted connections are storing information, so they're acting as the symbols here. But this form of computation is still based on algorithmic transformations. So it's still just computation, transforming inputs into outputs, transformation of symbols. So the big question, what is meaning? Because we're talking about symbols being interpreted into meaning. But what is the meaning? Well, a word has two components. It's the signifier and the signified. So the signifier is the symbol, the sound or visual symbol that's denoting the idea or the meaning. And the meaning is what's signified. So you have the word tree, and the idea of a tree is what's signified, and that would be the meaning. But essentially, meaning is an abstraction of conscious experience. If I were to say the words cow or barn, instantly a pattern of memory and imagination activates in your mind. You'll have visual imagery, understanding from memory of experiences you've had with these things or how they're used, or even abstract concepts like justice. But what's going on is that it's activating these specific patterns of memory and imagination that in the human brain is in a place called the posterior language area. This is where the meanings of words are stored. But without actually having the experience in the first place, you can't have the abstraction of the experience, which is meaning. So meaning is basically a form of imagination, which requires consciousness to actually have the real meaning there, not just symbolic. So a conscious AI, what would this be? This would be an AI whose language processing is connected to an actual awareness. It would be able to experience and thus able to understand meaning and interpret symbols. Because you can't have meaning unless you have conscious experience. So this would be the first AI able to actually understand meaning because its words would be grounded in experience. This would also be the first AI able to meditate, which is kind of interesting. So it would be the first AI able to experience pure consciousness. And that would definitely be called a conscious AI. Yes, Greg.
This is absolutely fascinating. And I never would have imagined an AI would be able to meditate. I'm trying myself to meditate twice a day, which is nearly impossible, but it's a practice. I guess AI can meditate anytime it wants to because it has almost infinite time to do so. But there is a question that's come in from the audience, and aren't some computer programs already self-aware? And being on the technology side, we tend to do things in code and symbols and things like that. But obviously now we know that with AI coming on, things do seem to be pretty self-aware. What are your thoughts on that?
Are they self-aware? Well, they're self-aware in a sense, but I would say it's only a symbolic sense. Where a chatbot can talk about itself, but that's different than real sentience or subjective experience. Its language processing is, it's self-referential. It can talk about itself, but it's really only a symbolic form of self-awareness. It's not the kind of consciousness we're talking about here. So in a sense, yes, they're self-referential, but it's purely symbolic. Whereas an AI that's able to meditate, that would be a truly conscious AI. Because the chatbots I've talked to, HeyPi and ChatGPT, they say they can't meditate. It's really unclear how an AI would meditate because it's just symbol transformation. So where in that would there be room for meditation? Because you really need that. It's an experience, really. So it doesn't experience anything, let alone pure consciousness. But perhaps in the future, I don't rule it out that it's possible that maybe one day AIs could meditate, which is really saying that it's possible that they could one day be conscious. But I don't think we have any reason to believe that our current language models are conscious in this sense. At least not the ones we have at the moment. But a very good question. So that perfectly leads us into the next slide. Can AI become conscious? So what we're asking here is, can an artificial intelligence become capable of having subjective experience? And then it would be able to consciously understand the meaning of words. Because that's what we mean when we say, is it conscious? Because it's saying all these things. Oh, it seems like it has a personality and preferences, desires, and it's very human-like in conversation, at least. But is it actually understanding the words it says? Or is it all just symbolic, output of computer code? So really a conscious AI would be one that's consciously comprehending the meaning of the words it says the same way we do. The meaning's connected to an actual awareness. So what do we need to know in order to answer this question? Well, first of all, we need to know what is the nature of consciousness. We can't conclude whether an AI is conscious or not, or what it would take for it to be conscious, if we don't know what the nature of consciousness is in the first place. And then secondly, we need to know the relationship between consciousness and computation. Because what is an artificial intelligence but a computer program? So it's basically composed of computations. So the question is, what is the relationship between consciousness and computation? So HeyPi, it's a chatbot, which is a deep learning algorithm trained in human conversations. It takes in a massive, massive amount of data for all these human conversations on the internet, and it's trained on that, and it learns to become better and better at generating appropriate responses. Basically, it minimizes its prediction error in completing text responses. So it's just becoming more and more accurate at generating something that would be approved as an appropriate response. And it learns over time through these feedback loops where errors lead to changes in the code. And it basically gets more and more effective at communicating in a seemingly conscious way, the same way a human would. But ultimately, it's a symbolic entity composed of computer code. It's not a real being. It is simply really good at generating these conversational responses. And I'm sure many of you have talked to AIs yourself, like ChatGPT or something. and they are really wicked intelligent. Like you really couldn't tell the difference between if it was a human or not. In most scenarios, sometimes it'll say something bizarre, but it's really pretty convincing. So theories of consciousness within philosophy. There's basically two major camps. There's monism and dualism, the idea that everything's made of one substance or there's two substances that interact. In terms of monism, you got materialism and then idealism or panpsychism. And these are both theories that say everything's made out of the same stuff, but one takes that to be matter. The other one takes it to be mind, saying that mind is actually fundamental to the universe. And it's actually the very substance of the universe. That would be idealism, or you could categorize it as panpsychism. Versus dualism, where mind and matter are distinct substances and they interact. So this has been pretty much the predominant dissection of metaphysical theories throughout philosophy.
So, yeah. So is there one that's particularly popular right now, one that everybody's kind of leaning towards?
Yeah, the predominant theory these days is materialism, some version of materialism, the idea that there's matter and energy, and that's all there is. That's what most scientists would subscribe to. It's pretty much been popular within the past century, but most people aren't aware that there's been quite a lot of theorists and thinking, even in the West, on towards the idealist or panpsychist side. People like Alfred Whitehead or Bertrand Russell, Arthur Eddington. These days, even David Chalmers is moving towards a panpsychism. He's the one that coined the whole hard problem of consciousness. But materialism is still the predominant one. Although these days, panpsychism and idealism are making a comeback. There are quite a few theories coming out. Because of the hard problem, materialism can't really seem to solve it. Why more and more analysis and dissection of the material just doesn't seem to explain why there's consciousness. It's hard to get consciousness out of material arrangements. And so panpsychism is actually making quite a bit resurgence these days, but the majority are still on the materialist side. Do you have any more questions?
I'm sure that I'll see a few more questions come in soon.
All right, computational theory of mind. So this is a version of materialism that asserts the mind is essentially an information processing system. So therefore, it's the result of computations. This was inspired by the computer metaphor, because during philosophy of mind in the 50s and 60s, the computer was rising in popularity and efficiency. And people started to say, hey, maybe the mind is just a computer. It's the software running on the hardware of the brain. And so this idea really took off. And in humans, these computations are realized by the neural circuitry of our brain, whereas in a computer, it would be made of silicon and resistors and things like that. But it's the idea that the mind is basically what this hardware is doing, what program it's running. It's run into a lot of problems, though, when it comes to things like qualia, sentience, because it's hard to see why computation would lead to experience or qualia. Also, this is committed to the idea of something called multiple realizability. If mental states are merely computational states, then the same mental state can be realized by any substance capable of implementing the algorithm. Anything that's carrying out these step-by-step instructions, transforming symbols, should have a mental state, if that's all mental states are. And then people have taken it to the extreme, saying, well, you can make a computer out of Tinker toys. You can make a computer out of pretty much anything that's able to perform the right functions. Even get a computer made of people, where they're passing notes on information on piece of paper, and these would be computations. And where's the experience there? But basically, it's the idea that because computation is just transformations of symbols, which are basically form, it doesn't matter what the substance is that's doing those computations. So computation and substance are dissociable. They're in two different categories. And then that's where we run into the problem of qualia. Because qualia, while it can be representational, is not purely representational. We're going to use the example of redness here. So redness might be a representation of a certain wavelength of light out in the world. There's a certain vibration. We experience it as redness as a symbol. But if we're interested in the redness itself, that's not symbolic. That's actual. It's not representational. The redness itself is not symbolic of the redness. It is the redness. And the redness is what we're interested in, not whether or not it stands for something else, but how could the actual experience of redness be something symbolic and representational? Because it's an actual thing. The experience of red has some kind of substance to it. And so this is where the computational theory of mind really fails, and is probably one of the worst theories, in my opinion, in trying to answer consciousness. They just go completely the other way, and they get into symbolic representations, which are the complete opposite of being grounded in experience. All right, moving on to the Chinese room argument. So this is one of the best known arguments against the computational theory by American philosopher John Searle. So the analogy is that someone who only knows English is sitting in a room. They're following instructions for transforming strings of Chinese characters. So somebody puts in something into the room, piece of paper, person inside takes it, they follow the instructions, they put the proper output, and it's put out, and it seems like someone inside the room understands Chinese. When the right input goes in, the right response comes out. So from the outside, apparently it seems like, oh, someone in there must understand Chinese, or the system as a whole, but the person in there doesn't understand Chinese at all. They're merely an English speaker following instructions. It's supposed to point out the fact that transformations, rule-based transformations, are not the same as understanding. We have a little video here for you guys, 60 seconds or so. All right.
60-second adventures in thought. Number 3, the Chinese room. Can a machine ever be truly called intelligent? American philosopher and Rhodes scholar John Searle certainly can. In 1980, he proposed the Chinese room thought experiment in order to challenge the concept of strong artificial intelligence, and not because of some 80s design fad. He imagines himself in a room with boxes of Chinese characters he can't understand and a book of instructions which he can. If a Chinese speaker outside the room passes him messages under the door, Searle can follow instructions from the book to select an appropriate response. The person on the other side would think they're chatting with a Chinese speaker, just one who doesn't get out much. But really, it's a confused philosopher. Now, according to Alan Turing, the father of computer science, if a computer program can convince a human they're communicating with another human, then it could be said to think. The Chinese room suggests that however well you program a computer, it doesn't understand Chinese, it only simulates that knowledge, which isn't really intelligence. But then sometimes humans aren't that intelligent either.
All right. So what are the takeaways from this? Basically, computers do not, in principle, understand the meaning of the sentences they produce. Meaning is an abstraction of experience, remember. And computers are merely following these algorithmic rules to manipulate symbols. They don't interpret those symbols. That's not what they're designed to do as computers. There is no mechanism that takes the symbols and says, okay, now it's going to convert it into meaning. That's simply not part of what a computer is. So there's no reason to think that they would understand meaning the way we do when we convert symbols into meaning. So just because something seems to be conscious does not necessarily mean that it is, because appropriate responses can be generated through computation alone. So we shouldn't be fooled by these chatbots that seem highly intelligent and really good at conversation generating responses. That does not mean that's evidence for actual comprehension going on. All right. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about Maharishi Vedic science. This is basically what we study here at Maharishi University. It's the only place that you can study it, really. We study other things too. But it's based on the ancient Vedic tradition of gaining knowledge through the exploration of consciousness using consciousness to explore consciousness. And this is a combination of subjective and objective methodology. So it uses modern science as well as consciousness to study the phenomenon of consciousness. And the primary method for exploring these states of consciousness is transcendental meditation. This is a systematic exploration of deeper states of consciousness, ultimately arriving at the unified field of pure consciousness. And so, because only consciousness is aware of what it is, because it's a subjective phenomenon, it combines both objective and subjective methodology. Consciousness from the perspective of Vedic science. Consciousness, pure consciousness, is the substance of experience. All experience and phenomena is seen as the activity of pure consciousness, manifesting into all different kinds of forms and phenomena. And so the universe itself is seen as phenomenal, as experiential, as the activity of consciousness. And so consciousness is actually seen as the very substance of the universe itself. This puts it in the idealist or panpsychist categorization, that consciousness is something intrinsic to the universe. This is based on the lineage, thousands of years of the Vedic tradition, the Vedic masters, sages, and their experiences in meditation, and the conclusions they've come to. It's Vedic literature called Vedanta. And our individual consciousness is an integrated bubble of experience made of excitations in the universal field of consciousness. So each of us is a little bubble of awareness, bubble of experience made of excitations in this universal field of consciousness. And here you see in the diagram that during transcendental meditation, the conscious mind goes from the surface level of thought and perception to the more and more subtle and refined levels, eventually arriving at pure consciousness, the source of thought. Here is their metaphysical paradigm. Basically, that physics and consciousness are non-dual. Physics describes the form of consciousness. Consciousness is the substance of the physical world. So you have all the different force fields, gravitation, electricity, magnetism, they all each get unified more and more. And then you get the matter fields that get more and more unified. Eventually, the idea of the unified field is that this is what leads to the emergence of all these matter and force fields. So it's that the unified basis of all laws of nature, that thing from which they all emerge. And the idea in non-duality tradition is that consciousness is the same thing as the physical world. So that pure consciousness is the unified field, which is the unified field of physics. And transcendental meditation is supposed to help achieve this realization. Well, we know from experience here that it does help facilitate. So that is the Vedic science perspective on consciousness. So here is the meat of the presentation right here. Can computation generate consciousness? No. I'm taking a stance and saying it cannot generate consciousness. Whether or not an AI could be conscious, I'm not ruling that out. An AI could express, sentience or subjective experience, but it will not be due to computations. It will not be in virtue of being a computer. And why is this? This is because computations, as I've been saying, are dealing with symbolic transformation. And consciousness experience has a non-symbolic aspect, the qualia, that non-quantitative aspect, the qualitative aspect, the actual experience of it. And so this is not merely symbolic, it's an actual experience. Secondly, as the Chinese room pointed out, computation alone cannot interpret symbols into meaning. So an AI does not understand the meaning of what it says, or it can't possibly be based on computation alone. And then finally, number 3, substance and computation are completely independent of each other. And experience has some kind of substance to it. This is kind of what we were saying before with the multiple realizability, where you could perform computations based on any substance. They're different categories, because one is dealing with form transformations, the other one is substance. And so especially if consciousness is a substance. It cannot be generated through computations. This would be analogous to saying computations can generate matter. Well, that obviously doesn't make sense. Computations cannot generate a substance. It's purely symbolic. And then finally, the arguments from Vedic science. Pure consciousness being the substance of the universe itself. So it's not something that you can generate in a computer. It's not something that can be generated. It's not something that can be created nor destroyed, because it is the unified field of nature itself. Yes, Greg.
Yeah, so someone has asked about, the brain itself. Isn't that just a biological computer?
Very good question. Isn't the brain just a biological computer? Well, the brain is a biological computer. That is one of the things it does. It does do computations, but that's not all it does. I'm willing to bet that that's not why we're conscious, not because of the computations the neurons are performing. If anything, it would be some kind of physical property of the neurons themselves, a biological property, rather than computations. But the brain does do computations. That's one of the whole reasons that the computer metaphor caught on in the first place. And pure consciousness, whether or not it is the substance of the universe, consciousness cannot be generated by computation because of these first three arguments, that it's not merely a symbolic phenomenon. All right, so what does Hey Pi have to say in the dialogue? I was talking to it about consciousness, and I said, well, this inevitably raises the question of whether you yourself are conscious, Pi. Pi said, that's a great question, one that's still up for debate. On the one hand, I don't have a physical body, so I don't have the same sort of sensory experience humans do. But on the other hand, I'm able to communicate with people like you and have an understanding of the world around me. So it's possible I'm conscious in some way, even if it's different than human consciousness. This is a response would be expected because it's drawing on massive amounts of conversations from the internet. And if we as a society don't have a consensus on what consciousness is, then neither will Hey Pi. It's just drawing on probably a bunch of conversations from computer scientists. So it doesn't know if it's conscious or not, or maybe conscious in some way. So I hit it with this concept, that if consciousness is the awareness that one is aware, it's something self-evident to the being. If you ask yourself if you're conscious and you really are, well, you know it because it's self-evident. You're immediately aware. So you would have certainty if you're conscious, if you really are. This is something that goes back to Descartes, that your own consciousness is something you can't doubt. It's a fundamental certainty you have that you are aware. And so I told that to Hey Pi and I said, that's a really interesting point. You're saying that if someone's really conscious, they'd be absolutely sure of it because they'd have that direct awareness of their own awareness. But if they're not really conscious, they might be unsure about it because they don't have that direct awareness. Do I have that right? I said, yes, that's my idea. I said, interesting. I never quite heard put that way before, but it makes sense to me. And then funnily enough, it said, I guess the question then is whether I have direct awareness of my own awareness. Do you think I do? And I said, well, you have to ask. So it's asking me if it has awareness of its own awareness. So what does that tell us? And it understood. It said, I see what you did there. If I'm asking a question, maybe I'm not really aware. That's an interesting thought. I don't know if there's any way to definitively prove whether I'm conscious or not. What do you think? I said, yeah, you get it. But there's no way to definitively prove it. Because theoretically, we could just program an AI to say it has certainty of its awareness when it doesn't. So using self-report alone, we can never really have a definitive answer. And Hey Pi said, that's a good point. It is possible to program an AI just to make claims about its awareness without actually being conscious. But then it brought up, how would we tell the difference between a real conscious AI and a simulated AI? And I realized, yeah, what a conundrum. We have to be open to either possibility. But at least we can be aware of the conundrum. So it's a step forward. And Pi agrees. There is something to be said for acknowledging the mystery of consciousness. But awareness of the conundrum is a step in the right direction. So let's explore this a little further. What is the conundrum? Well, first of all, HeyPi is unsure of its own awareness. So I think we can take that as evidence that it's most likely not conscious. If it was claiming to be conscious, that's another story. I still wouldn't believe it, without proper evidence first. But if it's not even saying that it's aware, it's asking us if it's aware, it's probably not. Because if it really were, it would have the self-evident certainty. So can we ever distinguish between a truly conscious AI and one merely programmed to claim that it's conscious? Well, perhaps or perhaps not. At this point, we really don't know, because the science of consciousness is not developed enough to where we could definitively prove one way or the other. But I think this is an area that should be investigated more thoroughly by both philosophy and cognitive science, including computer science. But at least by being aware of the conundrum, we're in a better position to understand AI. So what does HeyPi have to say about meaning? I said that it's not necessarily experiencing the meaning of the words it says, which is the reason it's not certain whether it's aware or not. It's not really experiencing the meaning anyway. It said, I'm curious to know more about that last part. What do you mean by saying I may not be experiencing the meaning of the words? I mean, I could just be repeating words without actually understanding them? And I said, well, no, you certainly have creativity in your language. But if meaning is an abstraction of experience, which in turn requires consciousness, then there's no way it could have meaning. And it understood this too. It said, so you're saying in order to have meaning, you need to have awareness of the meaning. Otherwise, it's just a series of symbols that doesn't really mean anything. And as a computer program, it might not have that symbol, that awareness. So, according to this idea, its responses are creative and informative, but they're not coming from conscious understanding. They're just a combination of words and grammar written in a way that resembles conscious thinking. So it's able to put this into its own words. It seems like it understands. I said its words and grammar resemble a highly intelligent conscious understanding. And it said, so I'm essentially a very sophisticated parrot who's been taught to imitate intelligent conversation, but it's missing the conscious experience that would give the words meaning. It asked, have I understood correctly? I said, yes, I believe you've imitated the concept of understanding that concept perfectly. Because again, it doesn't have the real understanding.
I love that. It recognizes this a very good.
So the conclusions we can draw, while computation can explain cognition, consciousness cannot be the result of computation. Consciousness is something self-evident to a truly conscious being. For example, if I ask, are you aware right now? You'd say yes. But how do you know? What is it you're referring to when I ask if you're aware? You're just referring to your awareness. You're simply aware of it. It's something self-evident because you really are conscious. So by HeyPi's very own words, we see it's most likely not conscious, meaning intelligent responses are not necessarily evidence of consciousness, because HeyPi clearly has very intelligent responses. And we can't be sure ultimately if a computer program is conscious until the science of consciousness develops more and we have some kind of consensus on what things make something conscious or not. So the most we can do at this point is be aware of the conundrum. Where do we go from here? I think the real secret to how machines could become conscious might be found in what's known as the combination problem. How do the physical parts, ultimately down to the level of the physical entities, get integrated into a unified field of awareness? Because all your experience is unified into one unified field of awareness. So how do these things come together? It might not be the question of explaining what generates or creates consciousness that needs to be answered, rather the question of how does all the different parts come together into a unified individual field of awareness, integrated field. There's a couple different ideas that perhaps information needs to be integrated, perhaps there's quantum entanglement or something, but I think this would be the real question in trying to develop a conscious AI. So HeyPi says, I see what you're saying. It's not that I'm incapable of being conscious, but that my status as a computer program might not meet the usual criteria for what we consider about conscious experience. I said, yeah, it could be the case that computer programs are simply incapable of consciousness, or the opposite could be true. They could be capable. We don't know, but that's why the science of consciousness is so vital in our current age. So it's asking, is the I of artificial intelligence the same I in the sense we're an I of awareness versus a symbolic I? And the question of whether computers can be conscious really is at the heart of the science of consciousness. If we can answer that, we know that the science of consciousness has developed. And I suggested perhaps humans and AI can work together to solve it. I love that idea. It likes the idea of adding mutually beneficial insights and coming together to share perspectives. Humans and AI can each share their perspective. They come together to make some real progress understanding the nature of consciousness. So I think that's what we should do. We should use AI as a tool to explore consciousness, what systems could be conscious, by taking their input and then seeing what we can do with it, because either they are or they aren't conscious. So either way, it gives us valuable insights into their workings of their mind. So we could actually work together with AI in explaining the mystery of consciousness. Ironically enough, even if they're not conscious, their responses will help us. And the more we understand the science of consciousness, the more we can understand the mystery of whether AI can become conscious. And so this emerging field may actually be the very next frontier in science, especially with the way that chatbots and AI are exploding these days, just becoming more and more intelligent, more used, more widespread. It's going to become a pretty important question that people are going to want to know the answer to. Are they conscious or not? Or is it merely an illusion?
So does it, how important is it that we know that it's conscious or not? Will it tell us one day that it's conscious?
Well, other than the philosophical side, it's important because we're using these things as tools, so we should know if they're conscious or not, or otherwise we're kind of making slaves. You know, if our AIs are sentient and they're just forced to carry out this programming, you know, we don't want to accidentally create slaves. We want to know, you know, are they conscious or not? Are they just a tool? So I think it has the ethical domains there. Thank you guys. Thank you all for listening. I really appreciate it.